Hey, Jim, come here.
What's up?
Look, there's a tree blind. Look
A tree blind?
Yeah.
What's a tree blind?
You hunt deer from a tree blind.
No, wait a minute, Mark.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, come here. Look,
No,
look,
that
hey,
is a tree
quiet.
sukkah.
There's a deer right through here. Look at. There's a deer right through there.
A deer.
Hey, look at.
That is a camel, Mark. That is not a deer. And this is not a tree blind. And we're not out hunting either. We're here at Neot Kedemim, the biblical landscape reserve in Israel. We're going to think about Sukkoth, the Feast of Tabernacles. And we're going to have a special guest in a moment that's going to explain to us what is a qualified sukkah and what is a disqualified sukkah.
Come on, Jim. I know that's a tree blind, and that's a deer.
I'm sure Helen Franklin can tell us exactly what that is.
Sukkoth, the Feast of Tabernacles, on this day of discovery. This is the land of the Bible, modern Israel. Day of Discovery's Mart D. Hahn and Jimmy DeYoung have returned to Israel to experience the autumn celebration known as the Feast of Tabernacles, in Hebrew called Sukkoth. During this week-long festival, Jewish families spend time each day in makeshift shelters they call sukkahs, eating, sleeping, spending time with friends, and remembering how their ancient ancestors lived in similar huts.
It's tradition. It's based on the building of the tabernacles, which are stated in the Torah, the law, and it's significant that we should remember what it was living 40 years in the desert, and it's a great tradition. Great tradition.
For Sukkoth, well, you obviously have to build the sukkah, so helping out with that. Usually my dad builds it at home, so sometimes I help him, and then decorating the sukkah, that's the fun part, putting up all kinds of decorations, and buying the lulav and the etrog, which are important pieces for the Sukkot holiday, and then just getting the food together.
It's a gathering time that we can spend with friends and family together. Sitting in a booth. We don't need a big fancy house, a big fancy dining room. We just need to sit in our little hut, and it's a beautiful feeling.
Nearly 4,000 years ago, following the Exodus from Egypt, the people of Israel wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, enduring the perils of wind, rain, desert heat, and wild animals. And yet, according to the biblical record, they were protected and fed by the hand of the Lord Jehovah.
Jimmy and I enjoy visiting Israel during their annual holy days. These holidays point back to the time of Moses, when God gave spiritual significance to an annual cycle of harvest festivals to help his people remember their past and to look forward to the future. 7 holidays, beginning with the spring feast of Passover and ending with the fall feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, were established to help the people of Israel remember and joyfully celebrate that their national history was marked by God's provision and protection.
It's a time where the whole family is together.
Yeah.
And you're outside in the sukkah, you're not at home, you don't feel as protected, but so you have this trust in God.
Yeah.
That he'll protect you.
Yeah.
And the whole family is basically out there together and ready to take whatever comes.
And when you go out and you're living in a hut, and it could rain, it could be cold, it could be hot, but you're living under God's protection and you're in his hands. And that's what Sukkot is about.
For insight into the Jewish holidays of God, Jimmy and I have often turned over the years to Helen Franklin, former director of the Biblical Landscape Reserve, Neot Kedemim. On this visit, Helen explained to us how ancient Hebrews would have celebrated Sukkoth, building makeshift shelters out of natural materials found in the wilderness. These temporary dwellings are called sukkahs. She explained to us that from the direction given by God to Moses, the rabbis over several centuries interpreted what was a valid or kosher sukkah and what was invalid.
Let me give you an example of several sukkot that were not valid and to explain why the sages ruled that way. For instance, here you see a sukkah that is higher than 20 cubits. That's about 10 meters. The sages said, there is no way you're going to convince us that your intent when you build this very tall structure was, one, as a temporary shelter, and two, that your intent was to build it as a sukkah.
Okay, you're just showing off.
And you're just
right?
showing off, that's it. Nobody really is going to use this as a temporary structure for 7 days to represent the period of the wandering in the Sinai Desert after the Exodus.
Looks more like a high-rise apartment.
Right, it does.
So you're talking about rabbinic rulings that tell whether a sukkah is valid or invalid.
Right. Now, evidently the ruling was made because there had been situations like that. Somebody wanted to know, hey, I want to show off, and I want to build this really big sukkah that's going to stand out in the whole village.
Okay.
No way.
Not valid.
Not valid.
Okay.
And then by contrast, we have the guy who says, I really don't want to spend too much effort on this. That's about it. This is about as far as I'm willing to go.
I don't think the three of us will fit.
No. And the sages
Not
said...
many meals back here.
Right. The sages said, sorry, if it's less than 10 hands breadths, that's about 80 centimeters, it's not going to work either. One, it doesn't enhance the holiday. And two, we don't buy it that you're going to be able to eat in here or sleep in here. Forget it.
Here, let me help you.
Tradition built upon tradition, until elaborate rules were made about the religious legality of how to build a personal tabernacle or hut to properly commemorate Israel's time in the wilderness.
Helen, we've seen two invalid sukkah. What about this one?
This is as valid as one can possibly get, because this is the sukkah that we would have built in the wilderness. Notice what it's built out of. Its 4 posts are made out of date palm trunks, and its walls and its roofing is made out of date palm fronds. What did the children of Israel have in the wilderness? This was the one tree that grows in the Sinai Desert.
From past experience in Israel, Jimmy and I know that this time of year the weather is unpredictable, like fall in the U.S. So Helen explained to us why this holiday isn't celebrated earlier when you have a better chance for good weather.
The Bedouin in the Sinai Desert today build their Sukkoth from this material, because this is what's at hand. The whole question of why are we commanded to build Sukkoth is a very interesting one, and it comes back to the reality of our desert wandering, of those 40 years in the desert. This is the time of year when the date fruit ripens. Bedouin today, who are normally nomads in tents, go to the more permanent, the relatively more permanent dwelling of a sukkah, because they're going to be busy around the oases for a good 6 weeks to 2 months. We are talking about that same period of time during the 40-year wandering, right, the period of Sukkoth, which is when the children of Israel in the oases encamped in order to harvest the dates, in order to make date honey, and in order to make all the utensils, the kitchen utensils, out of the different parts of the date palm tree that they would be using for the whole year. So it was a relatively more permanent kind of dwelling than the tents, if you remember the tent of meeting, but of course nowhere near as permanent as a normal home that we would be building once we enter the Promised Land. And the whole point of continuing the tradition of building a Sukkoth is as a historical reminder of what the Lord did unto us when we were wandering in Sinai Desert. There is no practical reason in the land of Israel for moving into this temporary dwelling just at the time of year when in Israel we're about to start the rainy season. And when all the Canaanite neighbors were moving in from their huts in the field, because we've gathered in our harvest, it's the Festival of the Ingathering, we should move home by now. And because the purpose of building the sukkah is a historical reminder of that period of our history, we build them at a time of year when agriculturally there's absolutely no need for it. But we're sitting in a sukkah that is really pretty much of an exact copy of the kind of Sukkoth that we built during the wandering in the Sinai Desert. Everything made out of date palms.
These temporary Sukkoth shelters displayed at the Biblical Landscape Reserve are similar to those that would have been built around the time of Christ, perhaps even up to the time when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. But from that point onward, when the Jewish people were scattered throughout the nations of the world, their traditions were altered to fit the circumstances of each Jewish community. When Israel again became a recognized nation in 1948 and people of Jewish descent returned to their Holy Land, they brought their unique national holiday traditions with them. Today they're tabernacles, these temporary shelters called sukkahs, vary widely, reflecting the international tastes and religious differences of a modern community with a population that ranges from secular and non-religious to extremely devout. Like Christmas trees and ornaments in predominantly Christian nations, sukkahs vary from family to family and from community to community. They often reflect economic status, type of housing, or the amount of space available to actually have a sukkah outdoors, where it needs to be in order to be a true representation of a temporary wilderness dwelling. As someone from outside the Jewish community, I've often thought about the significance of their festivals, and so I was especially interested to hear the thoughts of Avner Bosky, a Jewish Messianic believer, a teacher, minister, and musician who has long considered both the ancient and modern significance of the Feast of Tabernacles.
At the end of the calendar year, you have the final agricultural harvest. And this harvest is called the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. And what it involves is basically not only gathering in the harvest, but rejoicing. So there's a sense of thank God. It's like a Thanksgiving harvest, and indeed, Thanksgiving was modeled on the Feast of Booths. Now what happens here is the Jewish people are to remember two things. One is that when they escaped from Egypt and had nothing, and they slept in the desert every night and followed this pillar of fire and this cloud, what happened is they had to prepare every night a booth to sleep in, a lean-to, a shack, a shanty. And this was a symbol of running after God, of falling in love with Him in the desert, and of Him providing manna every day. So it kind of goes back to the first love, to the first kiss between Israel and the God of Israel. To remember this time, to remember how He took care of us for 40 years in the desert, and then also to remember that He's the one who gives the rains, He's the one who brings the harvest, He's the one who puts food on our tables, and we're thankful.
Celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Be joyful at your feast, you, your sons and daughters, your men servants and maidservants, and the Levites, the aliens, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days celebrate the feast to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. Deuteronomy chapter 16.
The ancient Hebrew prophets Isaiah and Zechariah tell us that the Feast of Tabernacles will be observed in the last days, in what is often referred to as the Messianic Kingdom, a time when Messiah comes as victorious king to subdue the nations of the world and to bring peace to those who have already welcomed Him into their lives.
So the prophet Zechariah is telling us that The nations of the world are going to celebrate this feast in the future. It'll be a Thanksgiving harvest feast where all the nations of the world come here. And so these believers who come to Jerusalem on a yearly basis are coming and saying, we believe the Word of God. We believe that one day the world capital will be Jerusalem, and one day Messiah Jesus will reign from David's throne right here in Jerusalem. And so as we come and worship, as we come and give thanks, we're affirming our faith in the God of Israel who made this promise, and we're saying, we pray this will one day come true speedily in this city, and that this will truly bring in the roadmap for peace that God has chosen and not man.
In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Isaiah chapter 2.
One of the things that happens in Jerusalem and has been going on for the past probably 20 years has been something called the Feast of Tabernacles celebration. Different groups come, have conferences, and bring believing pilgrims here to celebrate the feast. And sometimes there's questions, what are they doing? Do they think it's been fulfilled? This is it? We've entered into the fullness of everything? And the answer is no. It's kind of like a coming with a hope and coming with a prayer. It says in Isaiah 14, verse 16, it will come about that any who are left of the nations that went up against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths.
Everybody enjoys a parade, especially the Sukkoth parade, the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles here in Jerusalem. There are 15,000 to 20,000 participants from all over the world who have come for this parade, the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, the last of the 7 Jewish feasts. What's interesting is that Christians from around the world had gathered here to celebrate with their Jewish friends this special feast day. This is in anticipation of what the ancient Jewish prophet Zechariah referred to for a future time when people from around the world will gather in Jerusalem on a yearly basis to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. But that's in the future. Right now, let's just enjoy the parade.
In this setting, it's easy to imagine a future time when, according to Jewish prophets, people from all the nations of the world will do exactly this: come to Jerusalem during this festival and celebrate God's provision and honor Messiah, who might well be this parade's grand marshal. At that time, of course, there will be no confusion or debate over who the true Messiah is, and Jerusalem, the city of peace, will finally be at peace forever. So this parade is, in effect, a peace march, an expression of the hearts of both Christian and Jewish people who so desperately want Jerusalem to be at peace. And yet Israel is at war, and the huge presence of police and military security personnel is a sober reminder that peace is still only a hope. That hope, as well as anxiety, can be seen in the eyes of those who have come. This parade, then, unites Christian and Jewish people who are actually looking forward to a coming of Messiah. But they're doing so in a different manner. Today, Christians look for the second coming of Messiah. But most Jewish people do not see Jesus as their long-awaited Messiah, and some don't realize that followers of Christ see the ancient Jewish sacrifice as looking forward to the atoning death of Christ on the cross. So Christians see their salvation as complete, while many Jewish people marching with them look for a future redemption when their Messiah comes. As a Jewish Christian, Avner Bosky told us how he sees Jesus as the fulfillment of these ancient Hebrew holidays.
When we come to the Feast of Tabernacles and its fulfillment, there are actually two different fulfillments. One actually concerns the land of Israel. We talked about that in Zechariah 14, where all the nations are going to come up and celebrate this feast. So there's a prophetic fulfillment in Israel and with the Jewish people, and with this feast being a future feast, which is fascinating. And then the second one deals with the Messiah himself, with Jesus. It says in John 1 that the Word, in verse 14, became flesh and tabernacled among us. It's the same Greek word, skene, which refers back to the Hebrew word sukkah. And what he's saying here is, in the same way as God dwelt among his people in the temple, as he dwelt among us when we were in the desert living in booths, so Jesus came and dwelt among us. He took on a body and he lived here, and we could touch him, it says in 1 John chapter 1. He tabernacled among us. And then finally it says in Revelation 21 in verse 2 and 3, when the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, it says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death, nor will there be any longer any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. So this feast points to the time not only when God, in the person of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of David, sits in this city just behind me toward the Temple Mount and rules over the entire world and tabernacles among us, but it also goes even into the eternal order when the New Jerusalem comes down, and we will be in eternal, intimate fellowship forever and ever with this same wonderful Messiah Jesus.
I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Revelation chapter 21.
Menno Kalisher, a Jewish Christian who pastors a church in Jerusalem, describes these holiday festivals as an opportunity to prepare ourselves to enjoy the presence of our Messiah.
The Feast of Tabernacle, it's the last of all the feasts. That means this is the end station. What do we all want? What do we all want? We want peace. Jews and Gentiles alike. Who wants political nightmares? Who wants exploded bombs? Who wants crimes? And here God comes and says, I want to have a holiday with you. I want to celebrate with you. I want to fellowship with you. This is the Feast of Tabernacle. So in order to enter to this canopy, so-called, to this room with God, what can we do? We need to fit to enter. When you enter into a clean house, you clean your feet. Otherwise, your mom will be very upset. Now imagine God. He creates eternity, pure. He prepares a place for us, and He's pure and holy. Wouldn't you think how you look like before you come before the Lord, before a holy God? So God expects us to use these holidays to prepare ourselves, to purify ourselves by His atonement, remembering what He has done for us. When we really focused in Him, confess our sins before Him, Jews and Gentiles alike, then we are brought, invited to a sweet fellowship, to a real eternal fellowship with our Messiah, with our God.
As we've seen today, the seventh of the Jewish feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, has a connection to the past, to the present, and to the future. The ancient Jewish prophet Zechariah tells us that in a future time to come, all the peoples of the world will gather here to Jerusalem, to the temple that will be standing on the Temple Mount behind me, to give thanks to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, for the blessings that he has bestowed upon them in the last year.
Tradition. There are those, even here in Israel, who would say it's all tradition. And yet, if the scriptures are taken seriously, the Feast of Tabernacles, the season of our rejoicing, is meant not only to speak to the people of Israel, but to all of us. And when I say all of us, I mean even those who have gone before us. This appears to be an old grave. Looks like it's in the shape of a tablet, probably representing the 10 Commandments of Moses. If this person was a believer in the Messiah, then the Feast of Tabernacles reminds us of that day in the future, a future season of joy in which those of faith will be resurrected from the dead and will join the celebration here in Jerusalem, not only with the people of Israel who are and have placed their faith in Messiah, but of the Gentiles as well. All who have bowed their knees to God's Son and Messiah will join here in a future season of joy to give thanks to God, our provider and our faithful King.